In 1943, the most powerful labor racketeer in American history walked out of a federal penitentiary after serving less than 4 years, and within months, the entire Hollywood studio system was paying him tribute. His name was Willie Buyoff, though by then the world knew him as the man who had shaken down every major motion picture company in the country, funneling millions to the Chicago outfit. But the question that haunted federal investigators, studio executives, and rival gangsters alike was not how the mob got into Hollywood. It was why, after the biggest criminal prosecution the entertainment industry had ever seen, the mob's grip on the Dream Factory only grew tighter. To understand how organized crime came to infiltrate the most glamorous industry on earth, you have to start in the stockyards and sweatshops of Depression-era Chicago. The Chicago outfit, the sprawling criminal enterprise built on the bones of Al Capone's bootlegging empire, was by the early 1930s a machine that ran on diversification. Prohibition was ending. The repeal of the 18th Amendment in December 1933 meant that the rivers of illegal liquor money were drying up, and the outfit's new boss, Frank Nitti, Capone's hand-picked successor, needed fresh revenue streams. Gambling, loan sharking, and prostitution were reliable, but Nitti had his eye on something far more lucrative and far more ambitious. He wanted to control labor unions. Not just any unions. He wanted the unions that could shut down an entire industry with a single phone call, and the industry he chose was motion pictures. The key to the scheme was a squat, foul-tempered pimp and labor organizer named Willie Buyoff, born in 1900 on the west side of Chicago. Buyoff had drifted from petty crime into union work, discovering early that the line between the two was practically invisible in the Chicago of that era. He partnered with George Brown, the head of a local stagehands union, and together they ran a crude but effective protection racket on movie theaters in the city. Pay up, or your projectionists walk out, and your screens go dark. It was small-time extortion. But it caught the attention of the outfit. Nitti and his underboss, Paul Ricca, saw immediately that Buyoff and Brown's scheme could be scaled. What if, instead of shaking down a few Chicago theaters, they controlled the International Alliance of Theatrical Stage Employees, IATSE, the union that represented virtually every technician, projectionist, and stagehand in the American film industry? What if they owned Hollywood from the inside out? By 1934, the plan was in motion. With the outfit's backing, which meant muscle, money, and the threat of extreme violence, George Brown was elected president of IATSE at the union's national convention. It was not a fair election. Delegates who might have opposed Brown were intimidated, bought off, or simply never showed up. With Brown installed as the public face, Buyoff became his personal representative on the West Coast, which in practice meant he was the outfit's ambassador to the studio bosses. He arrived in Hollywood in 1935, and within weeks the executives who ran the most powerful entertainment companies in the world learned a new and deeply uncomfortable reality. If you want to keep making movies, you answer to Willie Buyoff. If you find this kind of hidden machinery behind history as fascinating as we do, consider subscribing. This channel exists to pull back the curtain on the real mechanics of organized crime, the deals, the coercion, the people who lived it. Every video is built on documented history, and every subscriber helps us keep digging. The genius of the outfit's Hollywood scheme, if you can call it genius, was its simplicity. Buyoff approached the studio heads, men like Louis B. Mayer at MGM, Harry Warner at Warner Bros., Nicholas Schenck at Lowe's, and presented them with a proposition they couldn't refuse. IATSE controlled the labor that made movies physically possible. Without projectionists, films couldn't be shown. Without stagehands and grips and electricians, films couldn't be made. Buyoff didn't need to burn anything down. He just needed to threaten a work stoppage. The studios, which were spending millions on productions that needed to stay on schedule, couldn't afford even a single day of lost shooting, so they paid. The amounts were staggering for the era. 20th Century Fox paid $50,000 a year. Lowe's and its subsidiary, MGM, paid the same. Warner Bros., Paramount, RKO, Columbia, they all paid, some more, some less, but they all paid. Over the course of several years, Buyoff and Brown extracted more than $2.5 million from the studios, nearly all of which flowed straight back to the outfit's leadership in Chicago. But the arrangement was more layered than simple extortion. What made it so effective and so insidious was that Buyoff was simultaneously betraying the union members he was supposed to represent. He would approach a studio boss, explain that IATSE was about to demand a significant wage increase for its members, and then offer to suppress that demand in exchange for a direct payment. The studio saved money on labor costs. Buyoff and the outfit pocketed the difference. The workers, meanwhile, saw their wages stagnate or even decline, and they had no idea why. The men and women who built sets, wired lights, loaded film into cameras, and operated projectors across America were being robbed twice, once by the bosses who underpaid them, and again by the mobsters who were supposed to be fighting on their behalf. This is the dark irony at the heart of labor racketeering. The union becomes the instrument of the very exploitation it was created to prevent. For several years, the system hummed along. Buyoff lived lavishly in Los Angeles, hobnobbing with stars and studio executives, attending parties at mansions in Bel Air, dining at the Brown Derby. He bought a ranch. He wore custom suits. He radiated the confidence of a man who believed he was untouchable, and in a sense he was, as long as the outfit stood behind him. But Hollywood, for all its corruption, was also a place crawling with journalists, rival union leaders, and ambitious prosecutors. The very scale of the racket made it vulnerable. Too many people were paying too much money to too many intermediaries, and secrets of that magnitude have a way of leaking. The first cracks appeared in 1939. A columnist for the trade paper Variety named Arthur Ungar began publishing stories about irregularities in IATSE's finances. Around the same time, Westbrook Pegler, a nationally syndicated journalist known for his aggressive investigative reporting, started digging into Buyoff's past. What Pegler found was extraordinary. He discovered that Buyoff had an outstanding warrant in Chicago for pandering dating back to 1922. The charge was essentially pimping. Buyoff had never served his 6-month sentence. He had simply walked away and reinvented himself. It was a small thing, legally, but it was devastating publicly. Here was the man who controlled Hollywood's most powerful labor union, and he was a fugitive pimp. The story blew open the doors. Within months, federal prosecutors in New York launched a grand jury investigation. The key break came from an unexpected direction. Joseph Schenck, not to be confused with his brother Nicholas, was the chairman of 20th Century Fox and one of the studio heads who had been paying Buyoff. In 1941, Schenck was convicted of tax evasion related to the payments, and facing prison, he began cooperating with prosecutors. He detailed the entire payment scheme, the amounts, the dates, the intermediaries. His testimony gave the government the roadmap it needed. In November 1941, Willie Buyoff and George Brown were convicted of racketeering and extortion. Buyoff was sentenced to 10 years, Brown to 8. The trial made national headlines. For the first time, the American public got a detailed look at how the mob had turned a labor union into a criminal enterprise and used it to extort an entire industry. But here's where the story takes a turn that most people don't expect. The convictions of Buyoff and Brown were supposed to be the end of the mob's grip on Hollywood. They were not. They were barely the beginning of a new chapter. While Buyoff sat in prison, the outfit's leadership, Frank Nitti, Paul Ricca, Louis Campagna, Charles Gio, Phil D'Andrea, were themselves indicted in March 1943 on charges of conspiracy and extortion related to the Hollywood scheme. The indictments were based in part on Buyoff's own cooperation with prosecutors, a betrayal of the mob's code of silence that would eventually cost him his life. But the trial of the outfit bosses revealed something even more alarming than the original extortion. It revealed the depth of the mob's penetration into the American economy. These were not street corner thugs. They were men who controlled unions, influenced politicians, owned legitimate businesses, and moved millions of dollars through a network of fronts and intermediaries that stretched from Chicago to Los Angeles to New York. The trial exposed a shadow economy running parallel to the legitimate one, feeding off it like a parasite. Frank Nitti, rather than face trial, shot himself on a railroad embankment near his home in Riverside, Illinois, on March 19, 1943. The reasons for his suicide remain debated among historians. Some sources suggest he was terrified of prison. Others argue he was pressured by the outfit's own hierarchy, who feared he would crack under interrogation. Whatever the reason, his death removed the most visible link between the Capone era and the Hollywood racket. The remaining defendants, Ricca, Campagna, Gio, and D'Andrea among them, were convicted in December 1943 and sentenced to 10 years each. Justice, it seemed, had been served. The outfit's Hollywood pipeline was dismantled. The studios were free, except they weren't. What happened next remains one of the most suspicious episodes in American criminal justice. In August 1947, after serving barely a third of their sentences, Ricca, Campagna, and the other convicted outfit bosses were paroled. The decision was scandalous. The parole board's reasoning was thin. The public outcry was immediate. Investigations by Congress and the press revealed that the paroles had been engineered through political connections, including alleged payments to the attorney of the parole board and pressure from a Missouri politician with ties to the Kansas City mob. A congressional committee led by Representative Fred Busby called the paroles the most shocking instance of political favoritism in federal penal history. The men who had run the most ambitious labor racketeering scheme in American history walked free after less than 4 years behind bars. The message was unmistakable. The mob's reach extended not just into unions and studios, but into the machinery of the federal government itself. And what of Willie Buyoff, the man whose cooperation had put his former bosses in prison? He entered the Federal Witness Protection Program, or what passed for one in that era, changed his name to William Nelson, and moved to Phoenix, Arizona. He reinvented himself as a legitimate businessman, befriending Arizona Senator Barry Goldwater and investing in Las Vegas casinos. For a while, it seemed as if he had escaped the consequences of his betrayal, but the outfit has a long memory. On November 4, 1955, Buyoff walked to his pickup truck in the driveway of his Phoenix home, turned the ignition key, and was killed instantly by a dynamite bomb wired to the starter. The explosion was so powerful it blew the roof of the truck 30 feet into the air. No one was ever convicted of the murder, though the FBI concluded it was almost certainly carried out on orders from the outfit. Buyoff's death was a message, not just to former associates, but to anyone who might consider cooperating with the government in the future. The mob's reach was long, its patience infinite, and its justice final. The Hollywood extortion case was, in many ways, a preview of a much larger story. The same tactics the outfit used on IATSE, infiltrating a union, controlling its leadership, using the threat of strikes to extract payments, and skimming from pension funds, would be replicated across dozens of industries over the following decades. The Teamsters under Jimmy Hoffa, the Laborers International Union, the Hotel and Restaurant Employees Union, all became targets of organized crime infiltration, using essentially the same playbook that Nitti and Buyoff had pioneered in Hollywood. The Kefauver Committee hearings of 1950 and 1951, which were themselves broadcast on TV and watched by an estimated 30 million Americans, brought the reality of organized crime into the nation's living rooms for the first time. Several of the witnesses called before the committee had direct connections to the Hollywood case. The hearings confirmed what many had long suspected: organized crime was not a collection of isolated gangs, but a national network with shared interests, shared methods, and shared leadership. But the mob's relationship with Hollywood did not end with the Buyoff case. It simply evolved. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, organized crime figures maintained a presence in the entertainment industry through more subtle channels. They invested in film productions through intermediaries. They controlled talent agencies. They ran nightclubs and venues where performers built their careers, giving them enormous leverage over actors, singers, and comedians who depended on those stages for exposure. Frank Sinatra's well-documented associations with mob figures like Sam Giancana and Lucky Luciano were not anomalies. They were symptoms of an industry whose infrastructure had been partially built and maintained by organized crime. The line between legitimate entertainment and mob influence was blurred to the point of invisibility. Consider a striking piece of irony. In 1972, Paramount Pictures released The Godfather, a film that would become the definitive cultural portrait of the American Mafia. The production itself was reportedly subjected to pressure from real-life mob figures who were concerned about how Italian Americans would be portrayed. According to multiple accounts, including those of producer Albert Ruddy, members of the Colombo crime family in New York sought to influence the production, demanding changes to the script, and ultimately securing a deal in which the word mafia was never spoken in the film. Whether this constituted genuine creative influence or merely a negotiated truce between the studio and the streets, it demonstrated something remarkable. Even as Hollywood was telling the mob's story, the mob was still shaping the telling. The Las Vegas connection deepened the entanglement further. Throughout the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s, organized crime families from Chicago, New York, Kansas City, and Milwaukee controlled the major casinos on the Strip through hidden ownership stakes and skimming operations. Las Vegas was in many ways Hollywood's playground, a place where studio executives, stars, and mobsters mingled freely in the same showrooms and restaurants. The entertainment that filled those casino stages was booked through mob-connected agents and managers. The money that flowed through Las Vegas financed everything from real estate developments to political campaigns, and some of it, inevitably, found its way back into the entertainment industry. The mob didn't need to extort studios directly anymore. They had built an ecosystem in which their money, their influence, and their relationships were woven into the fabric of the business. The federal government's response was slow but eventually devastating. The Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, RICO, passed in 1970, gave prosecutors a powerful new tool. Instead of targeting individual crimes, RICO allowed the government to prosecute the enterprise itself, the criminal organization as a whole. It took more than a decade for prosecutors to fully exploit the law's potential, but when they did, the results were seismic. The commission trial of 1985 and 1986, prosecuted by then U.S. Attorney Rudy Giuliani, resulted in the conviction of the bosses of New York's 5 major crime families on charges that included labor racketeering, extortion, and murder. The tactics on display in that trial, mob control of unions, extortion of businesses, the use of legitimate industries as fronts, were direct descendants of the methods first perfected in the Hollywood case 4 decades earlier. By the late 1980s and into the 1990s, the mob's overt presence in Hollywood had largely faded. The studio system itself had been transformed by corporate mergers, conglomerate ownership, and globalization. The unions, while still powerful, were more heavily regulated and monitored. The FBI's sustained campaign against organized crime, coupled with the wave of informants and cooperating witnesses produced by RICO prosecutions, had dismantled much of the mob's institutional infrastructure, but influence, once established, does not simply disappear. It migrates, it adapts. Former mob-connected individuals reinvented themselves as legitimate producers, financiers, and consultants. Money that had originated in criminal enterprises was laundered through layers of corporate structures and invested in film and television projects. The direct extortion of the buy-off era gave way to a more subtle and harder-to-trace form of influence, one mediated by money, relationships, and access, rather than by threats of violence. There is a broader lesson embedded in this history, one that extends well beyond Hollywood and well beyond the mob. The vulnerability that organized crime exploited was not unique to the film industry. It was a vulnerability inherent in any system where concentrated power, whether in a union, a corporation, or a government agency, operates with insufficient oversight. The studio heads who paid buy-off did so, not because they were weak, but because they had made a rational calculation. The cost of paying the mob was less than the cost of a labor shutdown. The union members who were betrayed by their own leaders had no mechanism to hold those leaders accountable. The parole board that freed the outfit bosses was insulated from public scrutiny. At every level, the system failed not because of a single bad actor, but because the incentives were aligned in favor of corruption, and the checks against it were inadequate. The physical traces of this history are still visible if you know where to look. The old IATSE headquarters in New York, the studios in Burbank and Culver City, where buy-off collected his tribute, the vacant lot in Phoenix where his house once stood, the driveway where he died, the federal courthouse in Lower Manhattan, where the outfit bosses were convicted and where, decades later, the commission trial would deliver its own reckoning. These are the landmarks of a shadow history, a history that unfolded behind the screens and beneath the headlines, shaping the industry that shapes how America sees itself. What happened when the mob tried to own Hollywood was not a simple story of criminals preying on an innocent industry. It was a story of mutual accommodation, of systems designed to resist oversight, of men on both sides of the law making calculations about power and money and risk. The mob did not invade Hollywood from the outside. It walked in through the front door, invited by the very structures that were supposed to keep it out, and when it was finally pushed back, partially, imperfectly, after decades of damage, the scars it left were not just financial. They were institutional. They changed how unions were regulated, how studios were governed, how federal law enforcement approached organized crime. The mob's Hollywood chapter is closed now, or mostly closed. But the playbook it wrote, infiltrate, control, extract, adapt, remains in use wherever power is concentrated and accountability is thin. The names change, the methods evolve, the fundamental dynamic endures, and that is the part of the story that no movie has ever quite managed to tell.